Thanks. And thanks for everyone sticking around despite the fact that you've already had your free lunch. So I appreciate that. So a couple of, perhaps a warning before I get started is that I am not a computer scientist or an international jurist, and there are good reasons why that's true. And so a lot of this is conditional, so if I get any of the particular details wrong, I feel free to correct me. The other thing I want to mention is that I'm not presenting this to a certain extent as an expert presenting my findings. This is more an attempt to apply a particular argument or a particular set of normative tools to this particular question, and I'm happy for people to raise their hands and say, I don't share your intuition, or I don't think the inference is sound, so please don't treat me as any sort of authority as I go through. So my talk is about a sort of a thorny question, which is related to the previous talk in some ways, but I'm taking this from this perspective of jus ad bellum. So when can we go to war? When do cyber attacks constitute casus belli? I think what I'll do is I'll just sort of get started and say why this is a tense partnership between jus ad bellum and cyber warfare. So I want to mention also specifically that I'm not taking a international law perspective. This is a work in moral philosophy, and so there are going to be lots of interesting and difficult questions as to how to implement my particular view into some kind of international legal framework or international humanitarian law framework. And it might be the case that we revise IHL, it might be the case that we don't revise IHL if I'm right, and so there's going to be sort of a lot of interesting empirical and contingent questions about how the legal system is going to be related to the moral principles that I describe here. So there's a tense partnership, and and I'm going to start off with how I'm going to define casus belli, which is a casus belli is an action that generates a presumptive unilateral right to engage in military action. So I want to mention one thing, there are a couple important things here. One is unilateral, right? So this is a case, when I'm talking about a casus belli, I'm talking about an action that means that I, on the basis of my own judgment, can respond in self-defense. I don't have to go through any other sort of collective decision-making body. I don't have to go through the Security Council. When can I simply respond with self-defense? The other thing I want to mention is it's presumptive, and now this is going to play a role later on in the paper. Is that simply because I have a just cause in terms of just war theory does not mean that military action response is justified, because there are other conditions that need to be satisfied, namely proportionality and necessity. Right? So it's entirely possible that something could generate a casus belli, and this is just a conceptual mapping for me. I'm not saying this maps onto any sort of international legal set of legal concepts. What I'm just saying here is that it's possible for there to be a just cause, and yet there can be no proportional or necessary military means for responding, and so as a result, you are not justified in responding, even though there's a casus belli. So there's basically, in just war theory, there's one casus belli, and really only one casus belli. So for going to war, and that is individual or collective self-defense against aggression. So there's really only one reason why anybody can go to war, and that is to defend against aggression. But so this leads to a tense and difficult question, which is that how can cyber attacks be examples of aggression if they are non-physical and supposedly non-violent? So this picture, I don't know if anyone guessed, this is from the movie Sneakers, which is I think a really pretty entertaining movie about basically code breaking. I'm sure it's not at all accurate. But in this point, the person was talking about, it's no longer, Ben Kingsley's talking about, we're not talking about missiles and tanks and bullets, we're now talking about information and ones and zeros. And information presumably is non-physical, right? So if it's non-physical, then how can it be aggressive? That seems to be the main question when it comes to casus belli and cyber warfare. And so there's a new consensus that has arisen in the face of this difficulty. I call it a consensus. I think probably, certainly the majority of the people that I've looked at that have engaged in this question have all come up with more or less the same answer, which is that aggression has now been redefined to focus on the consequences and not the means of the action. Right? So rather than focus on whether I take aggressive and violent means, that is, bullets, bombs, knives, swords. What matters is the consequence of my action, and that is, do I produce the relevant sorts of physical consequences? So the casus belli occurs when an action intentionally produces serious physical damage, injuries, or deaths, regardless of mechanism. So the idea is the physical consequences are not matter, not the physical means. So Michael Schmidt has this quotation: armed coercion is not defined by whether or not kinetic energy is employed or released, but rather by the nature of the direct results caused, specifically physical damage and human injury. So I think there is this additional question about disruptive cyber attacks, which I'm not going to really engage, except indirectly. But this is, I think, in many ways represents a consensus view of how to revise the just war tradition in order to make it applicable to cyber attacks, which are purportedly non-physical, and say it doesn't matter that the attacks themselves are non-physical as long as they produce physical consequences. So I'm going to present some problems for the standard view or for the new consensus. And I'm going to do it in a series of steps and try to present what I think to be the problem with this new consensus, and hopefully I'll motivate my view in particular. So the first thing, let's talk about this case, Torpedo. The flagship of the largest state's navy, of the target state's navy, is severely damaged by a torpedo from a submarine, preventing it from being deployed in a territorial dispute. What do we think? Casus belli in all likelihood? You can say no. Yes, this is clearly a case of casus belli, seems to me. So, I mean, again, there might be some complementing circumstances, but it seems that if you blow up a ship with a torpedo, that counts as a casus belli under normal circumstances. All right, and I take this to be uncontroversial. I don't know, I see some puzzled faces. I'm not sure, but I take this to be uncontroversial. No.
You're not guaranteed you know the identity.
So it's holding things like attribution and various things like that constant, which I will be more or less doing throughout the paper because I'm a philosopher and I don't have to care about the way the real world is. So it's a big advantage. Now let's take a look at logic bomb. And again, I'm using technical terminology like hacks, and I don't know if it's accurate or not, so please let me know. A computer operator, under the employ and direction of a rival state, hacks into the computer systems of the target state's flagship and subtly changes its navigation software. As a consequence, the ship is severely damaged as it runs into a shoal. All right, so we can imagine this seems like a straightforward sort of cyber attack that has military consequences. And this is the case at bar, so to speak. So this is the disputed case. It's non-physical means, but it has physical consequences. I think most of us would want our theory of casus belli to incorporate logic bomb and say logic bomb is really, in terms of generating a right to self-defense, is really not much different than torpedo. Agreed. Great. Okay. All right.
Let's not make this call a question.
Oh, all right. So embargo. Upon being subject to an economic embargo from a rival state, the target state foreseeably reduces its budget for military preparedness. As a consequence, the engine of its flagship becomes damaged as a result of under maintenance. The vessel cannot be put to sea during the ensuing dispute. I'm taking this as a clear case of something that is not a casus belli, right? So this is, again, an intuition I'm generating here is that this is not the sort of action that typically we understand as generating a unilateral right to self-defense. So the idea is that this would not justify military action on behalf of the target state. And so the idea here is that what I'm going to point to is that the standard view, the new consensus has to say that embargo is, or at least cannot avoid the consequence that embargo is now a casus belli. And in fact, I'm going to go even deeper and present you, I think, an even more difficult case, which is rare earth minerals. And in this case, X and Y are engaged in a territorial dispute, and one country is using its monopoly over rare earth minerals in order to sort of put pressure on the other state. The pressured state engages in a crash program to create ersatz new replacements of these minerals. As a result of the success of this program, the country with the monopoly in rare earth minerals will suffer massive economic dislocations, causing all sorts of physical damage. As a result, people are likely to die. When you create economic dislocations, people die before they would have otherwise, right? So the idea here is that this kind of producing this ersatz new replacements for rare earth minerals will result in physical damage to one country. All right. I want to say it seems pretty clear to me that rare earth minerals generating this new program, creating this new program to create these replacements for these rare earth minerals is not a casus belli, and the first country, the country with the monopoly, would not be justified in using military force to stop the program. Okay. Now, so what's the point? The point here is that it seems like these are all non-violent means for generating physical consequences. And I think we can imagine cases where you would be intentionally producing those means through these non-violent methods. So this gives rise to a problem for the standard view, which is why do only some non-violent means for producing physical consequences generate casus belli? So why does logic bomb, which is non-physical, why does that generate a casus belli, but embargo on rare earth minerals do not? All right. And so attempts to maintain this distinction based on directness, all right, or what you intended to produce are unlikely to work, and they're unlikely to work for two reasons. Right. One reason is that it's not obvious to me that directness is morally relevant. It might be legally relevant, but it doesn't seem morally relevant, right? And we can imagine cases where we generate these sort of extended Rube Goldberg machines that temporally and causally distance what we take to be standard casus belli from their consequences, and we don't think that it matters. All right, we don't think that it matters. So I'm not confident that you can use directness or intentionality to solve the problem here. So this motivates a new approach, a sovereignty-based approach. Okay, and so first of all, I want to get at what is sovereignty, and these are a bundle of rods that make up the Roman fasces. And so what I want to present is an account of sovereignty that really represents a bundle of rights, privileges, and powers. So this is very much akin to property rights, right? So when we think about what sovereignty is, what we're really thinking is we're assigning a series of essentially moral powers and moral rights to a political collective. And what's the purpose of sovereignty, right? Why do we assign? Why do we assign? I realize I'm going very fast over a big topic. Why do we have sovereignty? Okay, so I'm presenting a view as to what morally justifies us granting sovereignty to political communities, or at least some political communities. We probably don't want to grant them to all political communities, or at least you can lose your sovereignty on the basis of other things like responsibility, failure to follow through on the responsibility to protect and that sort of thing. But what I want to present here is that the reason is self-determination. The reason why we grant political communities, these bundles of rights, is because we want to provide a space. We want to provide a space for these communities to sort of determine their own, the direction of their own policies, their own lives, that sort of thing. Same sort of reason why we think that we probably want to grant people property rights. The reason to grant people property rights is to give them a space of discretion for which to exercise their autonomy. I'm imagining sovereignty as being something quite similar. So what are the most important members of the set? Well, I'll offer two. I think the first one is a right to territorial integrity. That seems pretty plausible to me. It seems like because if you don't have a right to territorial integrity, then you don't really have the ability to determine policies within your own territory, right? So if people can come in and they can take the territory, they can remove the territory, they can invade it, then you're not really in a position to determine the policy within your community. Second thing, a qualified right to political autonomy and immunity from external interference, right? So this seems pretty straightforward. If another country can come in and can constantly sort of intervene in your affairs and direct your affairs, then you are not in charge. You're not determining your own path, right? So the idea here is that these are the two big members of the set: a right to territorial integrity and a qualified right to political autonomy and immunity from external interference. Now, I do think that political communities, as a matter of, in terms of political philosophy, can lose these sovereignty rights in virtue of some of their actions. Genocide seems like a good example. If you're engaging in genocide against members of your own community, then you've lost your right. You've forfeited your right to immunity from external interference. So this is the view I'm going to be going with of sovereignty, right? So the sovereignty is this bundle of rights, privileges, and powers that are designed to protect the self-determination of the value of self-determination for political communities. So how is this relevant to cyber attacks? Well, because I think there's a key distinction between two different types of unfriendly strategic action that both undermine and assault self-determination and sovereignty, but they do it in different ways. And these different ways generate different normative responses. So I'm talking about the difference between imposing costs versus imposing one's will. So the idea here is that the idea that I want to get at is that some cyber attacks will merely impose a cost, and other cyber attacks are an attempt to impose one's political will on another community. And when you're imposing your political will on another community, that's the kind of cyber attack that generates a casus belli. But merely imposing a cost does not generate a casus belli. That's the distinction I'm operating. But what is imposing a cost versus imposing one's will? Let's start with imposing costs. We impose costs when we operate through the political determinations of the target state. So let's take, for example, embargo. What we're doing here when we embargo another country is we're saying, if you continue to engage in policy X, we're going to impose a cost on you. That is, we're no longer going to trade with you, we're going to hurt you economically, but it's up to you to decide how those costs are going to be distributed. Right? We want you to judge that it's not worth it to continue fighting us in this policy and change your mind. All right. So notice the important thing is that when we're imposing costs, we are operating through the self-determination of the target state. We're imposing a cost on it, but we're not. But we're saying we want you to make the judgment. We're operating through your judgment. When we're imposing one's will, though, this operates in spite of the political determinations of the target state. It's regardless of resistance, right? So this is an action. What we're trying to do here is that we don't care what you judge, right? We don't care what you judge. We're going to produce the effect no matter what. And we might try to do it cheaply through cyber attacks, or we might try to do it more expensively through invasion. But the idea here is that when you're imposing one's will, the idea is that we've no longer expressed any respect for your self-determination rights. Let me give you an example interpersonally. I think it's a little bit easier to see this. Imagine that I tell somebody that if they don't go across the room, then I will attempt to get them fired. Right? So that's imposing a cost. It's imposing a cost. Definitely is. Being fired is a cost. Right? But then that person has to say, is my job worth crossing the room? Imposing my will is I pick that person up and I carry them across the room against their will, right? So notice their judgment about whether they should cross the room is now irrelevant. I'm now doing it in spite of their judgment. That's imposing a will versus imposing a cost. Now, why does this matter? So when it comes to imposing costs, we're presenting the question of how shall we distribute the costs being imposed by the unfriendly state. Right, so the embargo, we're creating an economic cost, but ultimately it is up to the target state how to distribute those costs. So there's a sense in which we're operating through the judgments of the target state. This can be deeply unjust. I want to be very clear about this. Because people seem to be thinking, a lot of times want to say, well, I'm just saying imposing costs is hunky-dory. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying it's okay to threaten to fire someone if they won't cross the room. Imposing costs can be deeply unjust. For example, I think U.S. policy with regard to Cuba or something, the embargo on Cuba, can be deeply unjust, right? All right? But even though it's unjust, even though you're being treated unjustly, it does not generate a unilateral right to self-defense. And my argument for this is because it still treats the political community as self-determining, right? It assumes they can weigh the benefits and costs, and they can act on them. Right? So there's a sense in which we're still respecting them as a self-determining community. We're not doing a very good job of it. We're unfairly burdening their exercise of self-determination, but we're still treating them as self-determining, so it does not generate a casus belli. Imposing one's will, though, does generate a casus belli precisely because we have now bypassed their self-determination rights entirely. Think about the case with the room, right? If I say that I'll try to get you fired if you don't cross the room, it's not obvious that you can punch me in the face in order to keep me from doing that, right? But if I pick you up and start carrying you across the room, it does seem pretty obvious that you can punch me in the face to keep me from doing that. That's the fundamental intuition here. I'm not sure everyone shares that intuition, but that's my fundamental intuition in those two cases. I actually think this is consistent with much theorizing about war. So think about Clausewitz. He says, war is thus an act of force to compel our enemy to do our will. Force, that is physical force, for moral force has no existence save as expressed in the state and the law, is thus the means of war. To impose our will on the enemy is its object. To secure that object, we must render our enemy powerless, and that, in theory, is the aim of warfare. So the idea here is that Clausewitz was right that it's about that war is about compulsion, the compulsion to compel the enemy to do your will. Where he's wrong is that the only way to compel somebody is through physical force. We now have new means for compelling people to do our will. All right, compelling people to do our will, besides physical force. We now have cyber force. All right, so a couple of complications, right? So hopefully this will describe this will fill out the view a little bit. First one is, how on earth can you tell the difference between imposing costs and imposing one's will? How do we really get at the distinction here? Well, so I have a picture here. This is a picture of a U-2 aircraft. And so I want to talk about the idea of probing, right? The idea that there seems to be cases where we want to say we might be violating the territorial integrity. We might be violating the territorial integrity of another country by probing their defenses, but it's not a casus belli. So this is, I hope, illustrates the distinction between the two. I want to say that response to resistance seems to be a key indicator of whether you're imposing a will or imposing a cost. The point is that if you're imposing your will, then what you're trying to do is you're trying to overcome resistance. So the mere fact that someone resists you should not deter you from imposing your will, right? Should not deter you from imposing your will, because the whole point of imposing your will is to do it in the face of resistance, is to overcome resistance. However, imposing costs, right? We're not trying to overcome resistance. We're simply trying to impose a certain set of costs on them. So if they resist us, then we immediately pull back, right? So the idea here is that in the case of, so I'm imagining a case of probing, where what I do is I go into the enemy airspace, and the moment they sort of light me up with their radar, the moment it looks like that they're resisting, I retreat, right? I don't try to overcome the resistance at all. I immediately retreat. In that case, it doesn't look like I'm trying to impose my will on the enemy, all right, on the target state. Okay, and this is sort of supported by international law, where things that look like probing have been found not to be casus belli. So I'm kind of using that as as a bit of an intuition pump to get you sort of on my side. All right. And this is, I think, it might be relevant later on for distributive denial of service attacks, which I think are essentially probing, right? So this is the idea that most DDoS attacks are going to be essentially attempts to impose costs on the target system without necessarily imposing one's will. Okay. So complication 2. Can an imposition of cost become an imposition of will? Can an imposition of cost be so bad, be so severe, right, that it counts as an imposition of will? I think the answer is clearly yes, all right? But it's not simply a matter of how bad the consequences are. So my view is hopefully going to provide some guidance as to when imposing a cost imposition is so severe and so bad that it counts as actually an imposition of will. And so here's an example of a case where you might think that the imposition of costs is so bad, or so is structured in a particular way that leads to an imposition of will. Imagine a mugger says your money, comes up to you and says your money or your life. I don't know, has anyone ever seen the Bob Hope bit where he's like pauses for a second, and then the guy says, well, and he's like, I'm thinking, okay, right, my money or my life. And so the idea behind this is that what the mugger is doing is imposing a cost that is so severe is so severe that in fact it's no longer an imposition of cost, it's now an imposition of will. That's the idea. So how do we figure this out? When does an imposition of a cost become an imposition of will? It's always to look at how the costs are targeted or structured. So the idea is, do the costs undermine the ability of the target state to make and act upon its own political judgments? So are the costs so bad and targeted in just such a way that they make it so that the state can't, the political community cannot engage in self-determination? That's the ultimate standard. So I have here a picture of Tallinn, Estonia, right, where they were like the famous cyber attacks that occurred there. I would say probably those attacks did not rise to the level of casus belli, because even though they imposed pretty significant costs on Tallinn, Estonia, they did not undermine the country's ability to engage in sort of a self-determining political judgments and then act on those judgments. But I could be wrong empirically about that. It's just that what I have provided here is a standard for determining when costs have become sufficiently egregious that they become an imposition of will. So what are some consequences for cyber warfare? All right. So cyber attacks that are impositions of will, regardless of their targets, are in principle casus belli. That is, those that act to overcome resistance and impose a change of behavior upon the target state or members of the target state without acting through the sincere and informed political judgments of the target are casus belli. This should get everyone like, that's crazy, and I agree. We'll get there, all right? But this implies that relatively trivial casus belli, relatively trivial cyber attacks could be casus belli if what they're trying to do is overcome resistance and generate a particular consequence, even if those consequences aren't especially severe. Distributed denial of service attacks are usually not casus belli. They may become casus belli if they seriously undermine the ability of the target community to self-determine, but generally they're not. Why? Because distributed denial of service attacks, generally what they're doing is by requesting information, they're imposing a cost on the system, the cost of responding to the requests. But they're not like other forms of malware, where what they're doing is they're trying to break into the system in some way, right? They just, whenever the system displays any sort of resistance, the distributed denial of service attacks don't go any further. So that's sort of the idea, that it's a probe. It's not a standard imposition of will. Threats and surveillance are unlikely to be casus belli in this view. Those leaves open the possibility of preemption if an attack is imminent. And this is because threats are not themselves impositions of costs. It's only when you act in order to force a particular change in behavior. Threats, to a certain extent, are sort of describing a cost to the target state if they don't act the way you want them to. All right. So this leads to an objection. All right. So I'm almost done. An objection to my account. The sovereignty view is too permissive. It allows trivial casus belli. And so the example, this is the picture of the computer science quad at Stanford University, where 80% of the undergrads now are majoring. So we don't get to see any undergrads in the rest of the campus. But this is where they all are. And so this is the computer engineering quad at Stanford University. Imagine that that another state targets the Stanford's computer engineering department, targets Stanford trying to steal, for example, intellectual property, or otherwise imposing degradations on Stanford's system, all right, in the face of resistance. That, on my view, counts as a casus belli because it's trying to overcome resistance in order to impose a change in behavior upon either the target system or the target individuals, all right? That seems vastly too permissive. Right? The idea that the United States could respond with military force to an invasion of Stanford University's computer systems seems totally unreasonable. All right. So remember, it's now irrelevant that the target is private, and it's irrelevant that there are very severe consequences. There are no severe consequences. So both of those things, on my view, are irrelevant. What matters is that these attacks are disrespecting our rights to self-determination by imposing their will on us, even if that will is over a relatively small part of our lives. And again, like where I sit and where I am in the room, relatively trivial aspect of my life, I can still use force to protect myself from being pushed or shoved into the room, into the one corner rather than another corner, all right, even if it's fairly trivial. So the idea here is that the trivial consequences are irrelevant, and the fact that it's private is irrelevant. So that seems like a real problem for my view. It seems massively inflationary. So how do I fix it? Well, I want you to compare the standard view versus my view. In the standard view, the likelihood that military responses to peaceful casus belli, that is, embargo rare earth minerals, will satisfy the conditions of necessity and proportionality is very high. Why is it very high? Because it's a consequence-based view. So if embargo and rare earth minerals produce really serious negative consequences, that means that the way proportionality works, which was described very well in the previous talk, right, that means that it's much more likely that military attacks will satisfy the proportionality criteria because they're responding to more serious consequences. All right? So the counterintuitive casus belli, the counterexamples that I was generating against the standard view, they are likely to justify military action in fact and not just in principle. All right? So that's the standard view. If you look at the sovereignty view, on the other hand, that's my view, right? The likelihood that the military responses to trivial casus belli will satisfy the conditions of necessity and proportionality is very low. Why? Because they're trivial, right? Because they're trivial. Trivial consequences, therefore, proportionally only justify trivial responses in return. Right? So my view is very unlikely to justify military action to these trivial casus belli because it's very unlikely that military action is going to be proportional in light of the trivial consequences. Okay, people look skeptical. That's good. All right, so what does this mean? It means that what this means is that, generally speaking, the trivial casus belli will not actually generate justified military action. Now, here's and relatedly, in those cases where the military action would be proportional, I don't think my view gets it wrong. So let me describe this. So imagine that we knew with certainty that this particular that a cyber division of an adversary, right, has attacked Stanford University and produced X, Y, and Z relatively small amounts of damage. And suppose we could engage in a very carefully targeted military action that would stop that attack, that would be completely proportionate. Right? So maybe it just, I don't know, maybe it gives people paper cuts. I'm not sure, right? Right? It's completely proportionate, right? It doesn't strike me as obviously crazy to think that very highly targeted, proportional military response is unjustified in principle. Now, in the real world, that might be viewed as escalatory, it might lead to further attacks, it might be immensely imprudent to do it. I'm willing to grant that. But it doesn't strike me as obviously unjustified. It doesn't strike me as obviously unjustified in that particular context. Again, ceteris paribus, setting aside attribution, setting aside all those sorts of things. It seems like if we have military actions that are proportional to these trivial casus belli, then I don't see any intuitive problem with saying that military action is justified. It's just that in the real world, that condition will almost never be satisfied. Whereas, with the standard view is in fact inflationary because the consequences are really serious, is going to justify potential casus belli. And so I think that gives my view. My view is theoretically inflationary, but practically deflationary, whereas their view is both practically and theoretically inflationary. And so I think that's why my view is a little bit better. And I'd love to hear your questions on this. Thank you very much.